Disinformation, misinformation, and fake news are taking new trends each and every day. But how are institutions and governments tackling this menace? To talk that and more, we are joined by Jain, who is the CEO and founder of Logically. Thanks, Lyric, for joining us. I want to begin by asking you a very simple and straight question, which is that what are the new trends in this disinformation and misinformation? Logically has been analyzing this with the new technology, new tech. You're using artificial intelligence to detect, predict, preempt, and then finally alert agencies, institutions, and governments. But what are the new trends? Is it becoming even more difficult in a time when artificial intelligence is being used not only to preempt and predict, but artificial intelligence is used in deepfake as well as to, in fact, create this misinformation and disinformation?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, first off. But the problem's really getting more complex, and technology is certainly one dimension of it, right? We've seen how campaigns have evolved from, the early 2010s through to the mid 2010s to the early 2020s now, and the fundamental role that platforms are playing in this is really interesting because they themselves are fragmenting. There's no kind of single platform that is the dominant platform anymore. We're living in a world where disinformation doesn't just exist on your Metas or your Googles and your YouTubes. They exist cross-platform. I was surprised by the stat. There's now, I think, 150 social media platforms with more than, 20 million daily active users, 140 of them. And effectively, all of these are potentially places where assets, where disinformation campaigns can be created, can be leveraged. The role of AI is really important here, both in the side that's creating disinformation campaigns, but also folks like us that are trying to identify and respond to disinformation. It's like any technological revolution. There's going to be folks that use it for both purposes. It's almost analogous to, I guess, the world of kind of 70s and 80s where we were in the antivirus space, or even in the 90s and early noughties in the antivirus space, where there was a side that's constantly trying to innovate and create new viruses. Today, there's a side that's out there, both in the public sector and the private sector, that's innovating new TTPs of disinformation, techniques, tactics, and procedures. And we see them in the wild all the time. And the thing that AI, from my point of view, is making most complex is the problem of attribution. You can still identify disinformation campaigns reasonably well, especially using AI. It's one of those kind of, an AI knows what an AI created. Is actually one of the things that it's pretty good at. So I don't think that's so much the problem. The problem more becomes, all right, who's behind it? Why are they doing it? Because the unit economics of creating a disinformation campaign have gone from hiring a content farm, producing all this infrastructure to create bots, etc., hiring tons of people to organize and run these operations. It used to run into the high millions at a minimum to run any kind of sophisticated campaign. And now for probably as little as $1,000, there's companies out there that will create a disinformation campaign for you, as long as you give them a specific objective of what you're trying to achieve. And this technology doesn't exist now, but in the very near future, if you just track forward what ChatGPT, etc. is doing, there might be a Disinformation GPT, which effectively takes a statement like, hey, create a disinformation campaign in Arunachal Pradesh that compromises the territorial integrity of Arunachal Pradesh. And we're probably only a couple of years away from something like that being visible in the field. I could talk about this for hours, but one really important thing I think to note is the distinction between deepfakes and synthetic text, things like what ChatGPT are doing. It's not a new phenomenon. This is something that we and others in the field have been calling out for about 5 years now. There was something called Grover and other methods of generative text that came out many years ago. And the first place we saw this used outside of pornography, they're definitely the leaders in adopting such technology, but was in disinformation campaigns. We saw nation states as well as extremist groups start to use that technology to really augment the kinds of A/B testing, etc., that they could conduct. So that's, I think, the real challenge. The technology is bringing down the unit economics of disinformation, and because of just how many actors are now involved, it's making the problem of attribution really, really murky.
Well, since you mentioned Arunachal Pradesh, I have to ask you the China question. There's been an information campaign, an information warfare that is used by China legitimately, not just against India, but against the West as well. How does one tackle that? And looking at India, do you think India has the mechanisms in place already, or does need to do much more to tackle this kind of an information warfare that may or may not be successful, but it is there, a threat that continues to linger?
It is complex, but the first place that starts with is having a capability, in my view, and also knowing what you're really trying to achieve. Is it a tactical objective of, all right, we see a fire right now that is caused as a result of something that China's done in the information landscape? It might be a riot that they're creating in Arunachal Pradesh or anywhere in the world for that matter, or it might be sowing division in a particular community, because fundamentally these campaigns target vulnerabilities that already exist in most democratic societies. And really it starts with the question of, okay, what is their objective? And as in our response to it, what is our objective? Is our objective just to kind of firefight and respond to these incidents as and when they happen? Or is our objective here to kind of deny, degrade, and destroy the capability that China has built and is continuing to invest in? For context, China, there's estimates. It's really tricky to get any kind of financial information out of China, but somewhere between 4 and 8 billion is being invested by them in the space of information warfare. Not just domestically, that's probably at a similar level, but 4 to 8 billion being invested by them in running computational propaganda campaigns outside their own borders. You can probably guess where a lot of that is focused. It is very much in our neighborhood. And the challenge with that is that needs to be met with at least an intent to tackle a challenge of that kind of scale. Because the kinds of things that, in my view, make a difference here is switching mindset and not just fighting the tactical fires, which I think generally over the last few years, people have started to do a much better job at. It's looking at it at a strategic, operational, and tactical level simultaneously. If you look at some examples of when kind of countries have positioned good responses in response to disinformation campaigns, in the tactical sense, it's very much about kind of predicting, preventing, detecting in as close to real time as possible, and responding as quickly as you can. Those are the simple things, common sense things that we can really do. But when you switch focus into the strategic and operational, it becomes much more about, okay, what are their long-term objectives or medium-term objectives? What kind of infrastructure are they using? And how, over a period of time, can we first observe or understand everything that's happening with it, how they're using that infrastructure, and build countermeasures that allow us to, again, deny, degrade, and destroy that capability that they've built. So for me, it starts with a multi-stakeholder approach, not just with a single country, but hopefully with multiple countries that are taking this problem increasingly seriously, to rise to the occasion, invest in people, processes, technology to identify and respond to all the efforts that we're seeing from China in this space. And at the same time, technology and these investments aren't going to be a silver bullet. There needs to be equivalent investments in ensuring that we kind of upgrade the resilience within all of these communities that are being targeted. There's examples now of what works and what doesn't work. So let's be very data-driven about what kinds of media literacy programs work, what kinds of digital literacy programs work. Again, there's an example of something called the Bad News Project, and they have this app that allows people to design a disinformation campaign, again, in a sandbox environment, just to get them familiar with the concept. These are kind of quite simple, low-hanging fruit things that we can do to make sure that the general public is aware that they're under constant attack. It's not just the public, journalists are under constant attack as well, to try and be weaponized in China's disinformation campaigns. So I think those two things together, looking at things strategically, operationally, and at tactical level, simultaneously investing in technology, and bringing a whole of world, if possible, response to China's efforts, while simultaneously strengthening our institutions and our communities with things like media literacy programs.
Well, you spoke about the weaponization of information campaign through journalists as well. And one such thing that happened recently in the past 1 year, in the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the war that happened. And if we had gone by the Western narrative, one would believe that Ukraine had already won the war. So how does logically, or how do you analyze this kind of a situation, the kind of information that is trickling in from US, from UK, from all across Europe on the Ukraine conflict, and how does one deal with that? Because the Western, the West owns the social media, so as to say, from Twitter to Facebook to Instagram to Snapchat. So in that kind of a backdrop, in that kind of a machinery, how does one segregate fake news from the real news?
This is a really important area of discussion, because I think people really need to understand that there's a distinction between disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah.
I think this might be a controversial opinion even within the space, but for me and for the work that we do as Logically, disinformation truthiness doesn't really come into disinformation. The concept of truthiness belongs more in the world of misinformation, and there's various ways in which we can try and understand where you can come up to an assessment of something being objectively true. But in a vast majority of cases, very, very few things in the world are verifiably true or verifiably false. Things such as opinions, future predictions, narratives, these can't be fact-checked. These are narratives at the end of the day. And to be able to credibly come up with an assessment of something being true or false, we just can't do that with 90+% of information that's out there. But switching context on the disinformation side, the reason I mentioned we don't really care about truthiness in the construct of disinformation is because we look at methods. So again, definitionally, kind of disinformation is where there's intent behind the spread of misleading and harmful information. However, our point of view on this is disinformation is really at play once we see that methods that we know to be used in disinformation campaigns can be seen in the wild. So what I referred to earlier, the TTPs, the techniques, tactics, and procedures of disinformation, if we see that playbook in the wild, we call it out as disinformation. And it doesn't matter if that narrative is supportive of, one country's geopolitical objectives or another. Fundamentally, that some kind of information operations or information warfare is at play in that dynamic. And I think one thing we do need to graduate to try and do is focus, again, the work in the misinformation space is also super important, and things like fact-checking, etc., can really help move the needle there. But in the context of disinformation, I think it's important for us to move away from the construct of truthiness and start looking at the world through a lens of what TTPs are out there, what narratives are out there, who's trying to push what narratives for what objective, and can we technically see the signatures of this happening? Because if you can see those signatures, that's objective. We can't argue it's this person's point of view or this institution's point of view. And again, the space of disinformation research and analysis is still relatively nascent, but I'd like to hope if we're sitting again here in a couple of years from now, those are areas where the space is kind of further evolved, so that we take away the art form that currently is required for things like attribution and make it a pure science if whether something is disinformation or whether something isn't disinformation.
Well, we have a similar situation in Kashmir. You must have observed that for years together there was continuous misinformation, but not just misinformation, disinformation and misinformation that led to radicalization to a great extent because of the conflict that was underway. Since abrogation of Article 370, there's been relative peace in Kashmir, but still there are campaigns. One is a campaign of narratives that you mentioned, the Western press and the Middle East press targeting the Indian government on this. But there are, misinformations that come into play as well. And a similar situation comes in Punjab as well. Most recently, with the arrest of Amritpal Singh and the Khalistan propaganda and the internet being snapped there was again questions on law and order situation and a lot of fake news that was traveling in. That results in radicalization, that results in law and order situation aggravating, both in Kashmir as well as in Punjab. How do you see this? What are the kind of suggestions that you would have for the central government, the federal government in India, to counter this kind of a narrative as well, and also so that this kind of misinformation doesn't lead to further radicalization and worsening of violence?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the challenges of our time. Although we've made a lot of progress in recent years, radicalization and that's also causing kind of social cohesion issues is rampant at the moment. And one such example in some of our recent work, some of the crackdowns have been really helpful. For instance, the one on PFI a few months ago. But what's happened since then is, as all extremist organizations do, they've gone a bit underground, they've fragmented, there's kind of independent influencers and leaders that are trying to promote their own links and their own styles and philosophies within the now kind of pretty much pretty kind of degraded movement at the moment. It's not as significant as it used to be. But now that it has gone underground, it's starting to become more extreme. We've also seen evidence that it's openly collaborating with elements of ISIS. So that was never present until recently. So I think we've got to be very thoughtful in any attempts at tackling radicalization. Again, this is not a problem that's unique to India. We see this all over the world, where both from an intelligence perspective and a countermeasures perspective, we've got to be very thoughtful. Again, comes back to what is the problem that we're really trying to solve? What is the objective here? And if the objective is different, the solutions will obviously look different. But in my view, the first place we need to start with is having a better understanding. At the moment, I think organizations such as us, and there's many more out there doing great work across India, that are exposing these attempts at recruiting people online into these radicalized movements, both from domestic extremist actors, but also nation states, some particularly noisy neighbors. Those efforts, we probably are missing quite a few elements of those efforts at the moment, and really kind of central government agencies need to ensure that if they're missing something, they might be missing 0.001%, but I'd argue at the moment we're probably missing solid double-digit percentages of attempts at radicalization online. And that's probably the first place to start. Let's observe everything, orient ourselves to what's happening in this environment, both using the present context, historic context, etc., and then decide on what actions are necessary to do two things, which I think are a low-hanging fruit. First off, let's just stop the bleeding. So what I mean by that is, let's just cut off the recruitment to start with. At the moment, there's people at the fringes of society, for some reason, who are very susceptible to these campaigns, and them being digitally recruited, I think, and continuing to kind of grow in numbers through that digital recruitment is a big problem, but it's very simply solvable, right? We can track all these groups and people who potentially are on that breadcrumb journey to become very radicalized. Let's stop that from happening. Let's get to these individuals first, get them the help they need. Again, I'm not an expert in what that looks like, but I'm sure others have some great ideas in that space. But that again comes from, let's identify all of this activity that's happening online. There will be some individuals, again, I hate to say it, but there will be lost causes where people can't be de-radicalized. But there'll be great attempts where people are on the path to radicalization that we can intercept and put through some kind of de-radicalization programs. And the final part of that, I think, is also the foreign influence element of it. I think this should be very simple for us to crack down on, because at the moment, just the number of signatures that we see of Pakistan, China, both trying to actively either promote certain narratives that result in radicalization, or when they sprinkle a few bots here and there to amplify any fissures that are causing this radicalization, is really obvious. And actually last year we, for the first time, saw evidence of collaboration between both Pakistan and China in doing exactly this. Again, within certain many agencies in this country have the capability to identify such activity. I think we need to again look at our levels of investment, and all that's needed is to do more of what we're already doing. And for me, one of the easiest ways to do that is ensuring that all the organizations that are doing great work in this space continue to receive the investments that are necessary, both in the public sector and the private sector.
You mentioned PFI, but one final question that I have for you is about the Islamist groups, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, that have been directly trying to radicalize, youth in India as well. What has been your analysis in this regard? What is the kind of influence that the online medium, the social media, and the web actually, and the dark web actually plays in recruitment, because it has been seen for years together. There's been the famous case of the South, where at least 2 dozen youth, well-educated youth, were recruited by the ISIS, and most of them were killed in action. There has been recruitment from Kashmir and other places for the Al Qaeda as well, and several such groups. So, what's been your analysis in this regard? On recruitment, on radicalization, and secondly, the Indian intelligence agencies and National Security Council and others now have a perception cell, now have a PSYOP cell. What more needs to be done? Do you think that it is only up to them to have the professionals and the capability and the capacity building, or do you think there can be a public-private partnership with organizations like yours?
Absolutely. To address the point of recruitment, particularly the influence that we see from the Middle East, I think there's almost a mini industry that's out there that's doing this actively at the moment, and that needs to be addressed. In terms of, I don't have any numbers in terms of the levels of recruitment that we see, just examples that some of our work over the last year in particular highlights. The kinds of campaigns that we see are some very subtle, others very obvious. It's kind of ISIS or Daesh propaganda just repackaged, translated, actually not using Indian citizens, translated using some technology like Google Translate. So it's very easy to identify what's gone through one of those processes, as opposed to something that a genuine kind of local native speaker, etc., has come up with. And it's targeted at these communities where, again, these vulnerabilities exist. At the moment, an example that we've seen of that, I think probably not. We have seen some in the South, but I think one specific example that comes to mind is kind of the I think it's one of the emerging extremist organizations, the Kashmiri Front. That there's clear links there in what they're doing, in particular with Pakistan. And I think a report that we published last year actually showcased how the recruitment campaigns first were being run by organizations and individuals based abroad. They were then financed, and similar cells were created within Kashmir, and the same operations and the same recruitment campaigns were then being conducted from the homeland. So that's something that we identify, and the unfortunate reality is these kind of attempts are always ongoing. And it's not just one or two organizations, there's a few dozen organizations that are always trying to gain some leverage or achieve some geopolitical objective, or sometimes just for financial gain, conduct these campaigns that, again, causes a lot of harm, both in the short term and the long run. The kinds of programs that you identified, the perception cells, I think there's great work being done across kind of cyber police across India, as well as many branches within the central government as well. I think people will be surprised when they if they really understand how many intelligence agencies India has. So I think we've got some great people working on this problem area already. But fundamentally, in our experience and our understanding, the fundamental gap at the moment appears to be technology. I might be biased here, so this is a biased view. I don't believe government should be in the business of building technology, because 9 times out of 10 it doesn't go well. And that's what I really see as the role for the private sector, and not just ourselves, but many organizations to come together to create localized infrastructure based on local data sets that understand Indic languages and really build for India and built for the entire public sector, and not just one department or one at a state, local, or central level. And I think the private sector has the capability to do that. So I'd encourage as much as possible kind of public-private collaboration in this space, because I think there's learnings from both that both sides can learn from each other on. But I certainly see how the public sector can benefit from a technology perspective, but just in terms of being at that bleeding at the cold face. The public sector's on the cold face day in, day out. They experience these challenges day in, day out. We experience them more anecdotally, or if we're engaged in operations, we see them day in, day out as well. But that's the experience and nuance that private sector organizations aren't going to be able to replicate. And although open source intelligence teams and fact-checking teams, etc., they can help, really, we think an exchange of, again, people, process, technology between the public sector and the private sector can really do something in this space. And beyond things like the perception cell, I'll actually I quite like the idea that you shared with me and earlier, the idea of a central way in which we coordinate and combat disinformation. Because if you look at our surface area of how much exposure we have when it comes to disinformation campaigns, it's quite large. It impacts our democracy because elections get targeted by foreign actors. It impacts our public safety, riots, etc., being conducted, attacks on critical national infrastructure. It impacts our public health, both of individuals but also of communities as a whole. And of course, it impacts our national security. And if you look at that cross-section, there isn't one department that owns all of that. It's spread across so many different departments. But the challenge is coordination. At the moment, something might be identified at a state and local level. And yes, there are some ways in which folks can escalate it to the relevant agencies at the center. But there is a element of coordination that's currently missing, and finding ways in which there could be a central counter-disinformation agency. I think there's an interesting example that Sweden has really championed with this psychological defense agency that it's created. Could be a model that we consider. But again, with these things, these are just ideas. I think we need to find ways in which we have like low investment, try them for a while, see how well they work. And if it doesn't work, fine. Let's take a dispassionate view and try something else. And what I would love to invite is more experimentation in the space when it comes to solutions. And hopefully that's what public and private partnerships can deliver.
Jain, thank you so much for joining us.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yes.